General Motors redesigned all of its full-size vehicles for the 1971 model year after the previous generation, which had run from 1965 to 1970, required a refresh, let's call it, but a complete top-to-bottom refresh. And within the Buick lineup, this meant that the LeSabre and the Electra were all new for 1971, but Buick also introduced a new model for 1971, and that was called the Buick Centurion. The Centurion was one of the shortest-lived Buick nameplates and was only produced from 1971 to 1973, and it was designed to replace the Wildcat, which had its last year in 1970. Now, presumably Buick was trying to get away from that sporty image that the Wildcat conjured up and wanted to go more sport luxury with the Centurion. To that end, the vehicle really had an upgraded interior versus the LeSabre, for example, and it also came standard, at least in the 1971 and 72 model years, with Buick's 455 cubic inch V8 underhood. In 1971, it made 315 horsepower and about 510 pound-feet of torque, so it really was a tremendous torque monster. Those were gross horsepower and torque ratings, which was what the industry typically employed for the 1971 model year. But by 1972, the industry had switched over to net horsepower ratings, and the figures looked considerably lower. In this case, for the 455 with dual exhaust, 250 net horsepower. Now, aside from the engines, when you got a Centurion, you got a few, well, let's call them extras on your Buick. The first was, as I mentioned, the upgraded interior, although it did have the common dashboard and IP that was shared with other Buicks of the year, at least the LeSabres and the Electras. The Riviera had a little bit different IP associated with it. But one of the cool things that you got if you received the Centurion, aside from a unique grille texture that you can see here for 1971 was more of an egg crate texture, as opposed to the Buick Tri-Shield up front, you actually got a logo of a Centurion, kind of a Roman soldier on the front of the vehicle. This particular 1971 Centurion is a 71 Centurion convertible. I think one of the best looking vehicles in Buick's lineup for the era. Now, the Centurion was based on the LeSabre and a rototop 124-inch wheelbase, so it was a pretty big car, certainly large by today's standards, but I would say that it wears its weight rather well. This particular Centurion that you see here is a rather well-equipped example, and from this particular photo you can notice a number of options, including the road wheels, as you see there, the cornering lights, which I think on the Centurion are quite handsome. They're interestingly set pretty low on the vehicle as opposed to being higher in the quarter panel, but I do think they look cool, kind of like shark gills there that are rotated horizontally. It does have bumper guards, the body side molding, the door edge guards, and you can see the lamp monitors in the tops of the fenders as well. And one of the things I will also point out, this car does have the optional bumper guards, but the bumper on the front there is rather dainty, especially when you compare with the 1973 Centurion, and that's because by 1973, all vehicles had to meet a Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard. They could withstand a 5-mile-an-hour frontal impact with no damage to the vehicle. And so the bumpers on all vehicles got pretty chunky for 1973 in the front, and then in 1974, that standard was imposed in the rear. So the rear bumpers also got chunky, and the Buicks really had a pretty heavy bumper. So despite the fact that there are bumper guards on this particular Centurion, which were optional, the bumper is really not that big, especially compared to a few model years later. Now let's turn to the rear three-quarter view of the Centurion. One of my favorite views on this vehicle because it has this super unique kind of scalloped out tail lights that Buick had a beautiful theme here on the rear, at least in my opinion, for 1971. And you also see the license plate is well integrated into the bumper in between those bumper guards. I think that's a rather tasteful touch. And notice in the deck lid that this particular vehicle has louvers. Many, if not almost all GM vehicles for 1971 had the so-called GM Astro ventilation or flow-through ventilation system where the cabin air came in from the cowl, circulated around the passenger compartment, and then was exhausted out of the vehicle through these louvers in the deck lid. It seemed like it was a great idea, and as I mentioned, General Motors basically put it on every car for 1971. But if you look at cars from General Motors from 1972 and later, you really won't find these louvers on the vehicles anymore, and that's because GM experienced a fair number of challenges with this system, notably some backdrafting of the exhaust back into the cabin, despite the fact that the fan on these vehicles is always operating. It doesn't matter if you put the HVAC system in off, the fan is still on low. You really can never turn it off unless you pull the fuse for the blower or you unhook it, which is kind of an annoyance. Now, obviously, this car is a convertible, and you can see it here with top up. I like the white top on this coppery colored car, but I will say one thing about the top on these GM convertibles of this era, the 71 to 76s, and that is that they have a unique kind of scissors folding mechanism that enables the top to collapse on itself. But if you watch one of these in operation, as somebody moves the top down, as an example, it looks like that it's not going down in perfect fashion. It actually looks like it's somewhat broken. One side drops a little bit before the other. That is as designed. That's how the mechanism works, but it certainly looks funky, especially compared to other convertibles of the era, if you're used to operating power tops that kind of just drop in a normal fashion. This one folds in on itself with a particular mechanism that makes it look strange when it's operating. Here's another photo of the rear three-quarter view. You can see those deck lid louvers a bit better. Interestingly, as the 1971 model year would go on, GM would start shaving some of the louvers off of the deck lid in an attempt to help improve the system. It really just never worked. But the vehicles made at the front end of the 1971 model year tend to have more louvers in the deck lid than ones made at the latter part of the 1971 model year for that reason. If you look closely at the area below the bumper, you'll also notice the dual exhaust tips on this particular vehicle, helping that big 455 breathe a little bit better and probably also sound pretty good as well. Dual exhausts on vehicles with big blocks in this time frame were actually somewhat uncommon unless you got a more performance-oriented vehicle. They often came with standard exhaust, believe it or not, which tended to work fine, but you do end up getting about 25 extra horsepower on these GM cars and 15 to 20 extra horsepower on the Ford vehicles when you put dual exhausts on them over the standard stock single exhaust. And here we have the interior of this Centurion, kind of a plain Jane interior. Unfortunately, GM interiors for the 1971 model year just weren't as high quality as the 1970 model year, which, by the way, wasn't as high quality of an interior as the mid-60s models in a number of cases. So GM interiors during this time period were, well, let's just say not that great. You did get obviously full width armrests on the door panels. This car is pretty loaded. It does have tilt wheel and power windows, power locks, and air conditioning as well, power seat. You can see there on the bench seat. It does have the custom belts, which are color keyed and matching, and there are a lot of belts in this car and other General Motors vehicles for the 1971 model year. Remember, you generally at this point in the hard tops as well as the sedans had an overhead shoulder belt that you'd have a separate buckle for in the GM cars. So not only had the lap belt buckle, but you also had an overhead shoulder belt buckle, and that shoulder buckle was enormously large and heavy. Would not want to be whacked with one of those, and obviously solid metal, so that on hot sunny days in convertibles like this, imagine trying to touch those seatbelt buckles when the sun has been baking them for the entire day there. Not great. Pretty hard to buckle your seatbelt. In any case, as I mentioned, the car does have the deluxe belts, but the interior in this isn't that great. It does have a driver-centric cockpit, which was employed by all the General Motors divisions, in fact, except the Chevrolet interior did not have that particular theme. For whatever reason, I guess each division thought that that was an attractive theme to the interior, and it does look rather handsome in a number of instances. In the rear of the interior, you do have some overall decent legroom, I would say. It's not great, but these were full-size convertibles, and you did get a decent back seat that an adult could actually sit back there. In fact, 3 adults could sit back there, although the middle adult's going to be straddling the transmission hump, which isn't great. One interesting thing about the convertible tops on these, as well as other vehicles of the era that I find interesting, is that the mechanisms were just exposed. You can see the linkage there, and that was just typical of the era. They didn't try to hide it or cover it up, and I guess that it was just kind of expected when you got a convertible, but It just doesn't quite look right on a high-end car like this, at least in my opinion. And because it's a full-size car, you also got a decent trunk on these. Although the spare tire is located there on the passenger side of the trunk, well, which on the regular sedans and the hardtops, it would be mounted in the rear of the trunk, giving you a little bit more space. But you at least had some decent space in the trunk of these full-size convertibles, and that trunk wasn't eaten up by the entire top mechanism. You can also see this trunk is, interestingly, dry. The trunk trim doesn't look like water has ever been on it. One of the things I will say, if you're looking at one of these convertibles or you're looking at a sedan or hardtop, make sure that the trunk trim doesn't display any signs of water residue, because that means that in rains you have a leak somewhere, and it's generally not an easy leak to find or correct, especially on the sedans and hardtops. It probably means that the area underneath the vinyl roof at the base of the rear window has rotted out, and now it's leaking water. You just don't want to deal with that, so stay away if you see that. And here we'll take a look under hood. This car has the standard 455 cubic inch 4-barrel V8 making 315 gross horsepower. Buick's 455 was introduced for the 1970 model year, and this engine design was introduced for the 1967 model year as a 430 cubic inch V8. That was the top engine available in Wildcats and Electras and optional in LeSabres during that year. But it was enlarged to 455 cubic inches for 1970. 1970 would be the only year that the Buick V8 would be premium fuel, high compression in 455 cubic inch form. In 1971, it would have the compression ratio lowered so that it could run on unleaded gasoline. You also notice a couple interesting things under hood here. Buick was the only GM division that kind of put the alternator and the air conditioning compressor on the same side of the engine there. So you can see the air conditioning compressor belt actually rides in a groove on the alternator pulley. No other GM division did that during this time frame. You can also see the heater control valve mounted near the air cleaner. That's what shuts the heater core off when you have the recirculation setting on the HVAC panel. Off on the driver's side fender, we can see the cruise control transducer. So this is a cruise control equipped vehicle. By the way, those tend to seize after all these years, and then you'll snap the speedometer cable. So if you see your speedometer cable needle jiggling, I would recommend lubricating your speedometer cables, and if that doesn't do anything, be on the lookout for a new transducer. Lastly, I do like that Buick made a provision for replacing the fan assembly under hood here. Notice you can see it on the passenger side. On some of these 71 to 76 General Motors vehicles, accessing the fan basically requires you to remove the fender or the inner wheelhouse or cut a hole in it, because you can't access it, and it's just a big pain in the butt. But Buick on this particular vehicle made a provision for accessing it, and Cadillac did as well, by the way. Notice on this Buick V8, the distributor is in the front of the engine, by the way, similar to Cadillac V8s. But if you got a Chevrolet V8, like a small block, the Oldsmobile V8s, or the Pontiac V8s, the distributor caps were in the rear. So GM, sometimes the distributor caps are in the front, sometimes in the rear. Fords oftentimes are in the front on the 429s, 460s, the FE engines. So just a little bit different. I think it's a little bit easier to access them when they're up front, but some GM engines did not have that. And here you have one last look at this particular 1971 Centurion convertible. A handsome car indeed. I love that diving line here, or I guess feature on these vehicles that extends all the way from the hood, and that line goes all the way back to the rear of the car. That would be a feature on a number of Buicks for years to come. The 73 Regal would take a different take on it, but it would have a, similar theme, or at least conjure up that thought in one's mind. Overall, a super handsome vehicle and powered by a great 455 cubic inch Buick V8 under hood. For those who don't know, by the way, the Buick V8 was an exclusive V8 to Buick division. It was not used by any of the other General Motors divisions during that time frame. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this 1971 Buick Centurion convertible. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.